Can I welcome Baroness Williams of Crosby?
Well, first of all, fellow Liberal Democrats, thank you very much for coming. I'm very grateful to you. It's the middle of a very wet holiday weekend, so you're not losing as much as you might otherwise be doing. But it's very good of you to make the effort, and I'm very grateful to you for coming. And I'm also very grateful for the way in which you have kept the party going in this particular region. As is said, it's not particularly easy. In a region where there's a well-established Member of Parliament, somebody who's been there for more than a term or so, we find that Liberal democracy flourishes. It begins to grow around that person. So whether it's East Leigh or North Norfolk or Colchester or the South Lakes or wherever it may be, when you've got the figure of a leading and lively and committed Liberal Democrat MP, you begin to get the effect of that seen much more widely in the region. And certainly East Midlands has suffered from the fact that Paul Holmes was the only MP that you had, and he was there for one term, which was itself something of a miracle. But you haven't had the possibility of building around another MP since that time. Let me begin by saying, first of all, I remember Paddy Ashdown saying to me once, people shouldn't be downhearted, he said. I remember being the leader of the party at a time when the polls showed that the support for Liberal Democrats was an asterisk. Now, you only have an asterisk if you're below 5%. And Paddy saw his way through that and so did the party. I actually think the results aren't quite as bad as they've been presented. For example, the 16% of the share of the national opinion poll vote, which is substantially more than national opinion polls, have held pretty steady since the situation in 2010. In other words, what's quite clear is that there's a core of Liberal Democrat support which is very reluctant indeed to move in other directions. But certainly it has been a tough time, and the main reasons for that have been the sad state, the depressed state of the economy, which of course you see in your region as we do in all the other regions. And I'm going to say a good deal more about that in a few moments' time. But I also want to say this, because I think it's very important. We should take a moment or two to say a huge debt of thanks to the people that over the years have worked as Liberal Democrat councillors, and there have been hundreds and hundreds of them. They have been in many ways the core, the very central core of what it was to be a Liberal Democrat. And it's very hard to see people losing their positions when they put so much work in. If I may make just one personal remark, the single man or woman I feel most sad about today is actually Brian Paddick. If you look at the London election, there was only one candidate who solidly put before London a serious proposal for how to improve the London region, to get jobs for young people, to deal with the awful problem of homelessness, to address the issue of the attempt by some wretched councillors to drive people who've lost their jobs out of the capital altogether, sending them off of all places to places like Oldham and so on, which already had huge problems of unemployment, and could do without the migration, the forced migration, of good men and women who, out of bad luck, but happen to live in London. It's a very, very serious thing, and it mustn't let it happen. But certainly Brian Paddick addressed that. He addressed the issue of racism in the Met. He addressed the issue of people who are unjustly treated. He said he would resign, and did resign, over the shooting of Mr. Menendez, the innocent Brazilian who you may remember several years ago was shot dead by the police under the impression he was a terrorist, which he'd never been and in no way associated with. And the one man who had the guts through that whole period of time to stand up and say the way things ought to be was the man who then became, for the second time, the candidate for the London mayoralty. And of course the story was not so much that the good man had not been elected, but the good man got almost no airtime or press time for the things he was trying to say. He was in a sense squeezed out of the picture. And you'll see what I'm going to say in a few moments, because it's really relevant to what I've also got to say about some other aspects of what the Liberal Democrats have been trying to do. So let me just begin by saying thank you to the councillors who fought and worked so hard. Thank you to someone like Brian Paddick, who's upheld the principles and values of liberal democracy consistently through a difficult time. And don't worry, because the chance will come again. Politics is like that. I know because I've been defeated 3 times, and I've won 6 times. So I'm not talking out of the basis of no experience at all. I'm actually rather good at making very gracious statements after my defeat. But I never believed that defeat, and it needn't be for anybody, is a permanent fact. To be a politician, or to be involved in politics, you need to be resilient. You have to take the tough as well as the easy. And you will find that always there's a certain roller coaster effect in politics when you are at the very top. And you could say for certain, like people used to play that old game called Snakes and Ladders, that there's another snake around to take you further down again. But luckily there's a ladder further on still, which will bring you to the top again. Now, there's a joke I used to tell quite a lot, and I'll come back and see the point of this in a moment or two, which used to, on the whole, amuse audiences. It's a joke about the beginning of the world. The dispute was between a lawyer, a doctor, and a politician. And the doctor said, no, undoubtedly I came first, because I made Eve out of Adam's rib. And the lawyer disagreed and said, no, I came first, because I brought order out of the original chaos. And the politician smiled and said, no, I came first, because who do you think brought the original chaos? One of the things that's very true about that particular story is that what we've seen in the last couple of days has not just been a hard time for Liberal Democrats and a hard time for Conservatives, and actually quite a hard time for Labour, who are longing to see Boris Johnson defeated in London. What it's brought above all is a very substantial alarm call to all of us, which is about the fact that only 1 voter out of every 3 bothered to vote at all. In other words, what we are looking at is a very serious crisis of democratic politics. And it's not just a crisis in our own country. It's equally a crisis in France, where the president's been thrown out, in Spain, where the government was recently thrown out, in Greece, where they can't keep a government at all, in Portugal, where the government was thrown out, all through the Western democracies, and in that one can include the United States, there has been a crisis of politics. Now, part of that is because, to be honest, we've been living, all of us in the Western world, in a world of disbelief. We behaved unrealistically. We allowed ourselves to build up, of course, huge debts. Incidentally, I'm not one of those who is continually going on and on about the mess Labour made. It did. But the much deeper mess was the mess the banks made. And we haven't, I think, even now really comprehended how serious that's been. Again, not just in the UK, but in the whole of the Western world. We lived, or they did, off the high hog. They borrowed without any assets to underpin the borrowing. They created financial innovations, the hedge funds, which most didn't understand, including those who created them. And we're now living with the harsh outcomes of reality. And that's not unique to the United Kingdom. It's to be seen in almost all the democratic countries of the world. And in case you think that shows that we shouldn't have democracy, then better think for a moment about people like Mr. Cheng in China, and for that matter, other people in Russia, which shows what happens if you don't have a democratic system. So let's look at what we're trying to do, and let's make an estimate of what we need to do. Within the coalition, there's no question about this, as you know. The original reason that Liberal Democrats went into the coalition, and I never denied the fact that I was very unenthusiastic about it, was because we were much nearer to the abyss than most people realise. By the abyss, I mean the kind of collapse of financial confidence and international market confidence in this country, which would have left us in the same situation as a Greece or a Spain or a Portugal. Don't forget that our debts were bigger than anybody else's proportionately, as big as that of Greece proportionately. But the creation of the coalition, with all the downside we'll talk about in a minute or two, stopped us falling into that pit, stopped us falling into the abyss, because the world said this is a strong government and one that therefore should be able to deal with the problems that confront it. I can promise you absolutely, if there had not been a coalition government, then we would have almost certainly seen interest rates of 6% and the like, as in Italy or Spain at the present time, because confidence in our political system would have been lost. Now, we, the Liberal Democrats, have paid unquestionably an extremely heavy price for that. We paid a heavy price because we are the natural scapegoats in this situation, given that the Conservatives have, in a sense, assumed that they were going to be government, and given that they have the larger share of the government itself. But let's now look at some of the things the Liberal Democrats have done, and for which, if I may say so, they have got very little credit. You know, of course, that we managed to persuade the Conservatives within the coalition to put the least well-off first, in the sense of taking them out of tax altogether. I'd like to see us do a lot more. But all people who earn less than £12,000 to £15,000 a year will get the benefit of a couple of hundreds of pounds of tax reduction, and in most cases will come out of tax altogether in the current year. The second thing we've done that many people have failed to recognise that we did was to save the post office, not the British, not Royal Mail, which has been making losses for years, almost entirely because of the weight of the pension responsibilities it bears, but the post office as a future system of access for everybody in this country, and we're hoping that that post office will become, of course, also the sort of people's bank. A bank that doesn't try to exploit its customers, but tries to serve them, and therefore post office counters will continue. We will save local post offices, and for many people, particularly elderly people who aren't very mobile, that's a very important part of the quality of life. When Ed Davey comes, as he will do, I guess, from what I hear from ISIS, very soon in the next few months, he deserves a very large round of applause, because he stopped a public service ceasing to be a public service, and he also managed to introduce the idea of mutualisation, which means that post office workers will have at least 10% of the shares in their own companies, and will therefore have a loud voice when it comes to questions about the way the post office develops, redundancy and the rest of it. Incidentally, a pattern that I think we Liberal Democrats should extend much more widely than we've done up to date. Let me take a third example, because it's quite an important example, and that is that we have throughout been absolutely true to our commitment to civil liberties. That's been the heart of many Liberal and Liberal Democrat policies. Let me just rattle through a few, so as not to waste your time. But don't forget that before the Liberal Democrats came in to govern, Mr. Blair's government was talking about up to a 90-day detention period for people to be detained without trial, and therefore also without verdict, without access to legal rights. That was dropped within a matter of days when the coalition came in. We're now back to 14 days as the maximum, and we may go lower than that. But the crucial point about that is that when the government takes the view that it can keep people without proper legal process, you are on the slippery slope to a very unpleasant society indeed. A third example, probably what widely known, you may have realised that one of the things that's come out in the last few months has been the unfortunate knowledge that we, this United Kingdom, the mother of parliaments, actually managed to extradite people by what's called extraordinary rendition to other countries, knowing that they might be tortured when they got there. It's shocking to discover that we even extradited brave men and women who were standing up against Muammar Gaddafi's dictatorship back to Libya in order to ensure that we didn't create any strained relations with them. Imagine how we would feel if right now Mr. Chen in China was extradited back by the United States to China in order to face whatever may come his way. That is what we did in the case of some of the Libyan dissidents, and that will gradually be merged out, and we will discover what actually happened. But now extraordinary rendition has been declared absolutely beyond the pale. We will not be part of it again. again. We will not be part of accepting evidence based on torture. We were part of accepting evidence based on torture, as the case of Binnum and Maharilals have shown. So on these issues, and they're central issues for Liberals and for Liberal Democrats, the question of civil liberties is, I think, one we should be proud of. And don't forget that up until a day before the election in 2010, we were expecting to have identity cards, which all of us would have to carry. And we were also expecting something else, which was proposed by John Reid, the Labour Home Secretary, earlier. And that was that we could be stopped in the street, sus, could be applied to all of us, even without any grounds of suspicion at all. And we would be fined up to £5,000 if we refused to answer. So a certain number of really very troubling things have now gone away. Let me then address another one, which you may not know about. And that was the issue of health and social care. You don't know, I don't think, for the straightforward reason that the media never covered what actually happened about the health and social care bill. I know because I was up to my neck in it and have been for at least a year. Under the health and social care bill, very briefly, Liberal Democrats, first and foremost, changed the major priority of Monitor, the health agency which overlooks what happens in the NHS, from being competition, the promotion of competition, to being the promotion of the interests of patients. As a result of the Liberal Democrats, in addition to that, the references in the bill to the whole of the NHS being subject to what was called a competition commission, where the competition commission had to report every year what steps it had taken to promote competition, has gone out the window. That has been taken out the window altogether. As a result of Liberal Democrat pressure, the Minister of Health is now fully accountable and responsible for what? For a comprehensive health service free at the time of need and open to all. That has been written back into the bill, and in addition, every single clinical commissioning group is now answerable to carry out everything that's in the original National Health Service Constitution, or believe it or not, 9 Barons 1948. In addition to all that, we have laid down very strict rules about conflicts of interest. Every GP on a commissioning board must now declare any interest that he or she may have financially in the outcome and must not take part in any decision where they could be financially benefited. If any financial benefit happens, they can be reported to a professional association. This is a Liberal Democrat amendment as well, and they can be decided to be removed from their profession if they are shown to be deliberately attempting to benefit themselves. I could go on and on. There are many more. There's the absolute requirement that inequality in health provision must be an annual responsibility reported to Parliament. There's the clear statement that now every single person who is resident in the United Kingdom, or it's more precisely in England, must be part of a clinical commissioning group and cannot be excluded by it. There can be no cherry picking of wealthy patients out of the general group of patients as a whole. And that's now the responsibility of the National Commissioning Board, which is obliged to ensure that everybody, the homeless, the travellers, the kids living from within cardboard boxes, everybody must have access to health as they always ought to have. What many people don't realise, let me put this to you, because I bet half of you don't know this, or if you do, well done, or very well informed. Most people don't realise that under Tony Blair's government, a 14% premium was paid to private practice. In other words, if you had a hip replacement or a knee replacement, or the other things provided by the so-called ISTVTCs, the Independent Sector Treatment Centres, they got 14% more if they were private patients, private doctors, than they would have got from the NHS. In other words, a deeply laid down incentive to go private. We have abolished that. There is no longer any premium for the private sector, none at all. Nor can there be any attempt to change the balance between public and private practice as a deliberate policy, because there is now an amendment which specifically says that that is forbidden. You may not seek to change the balance between private and public sector unless there are clear reasons of benefit for the patients to doing that. Now, I could go on and on, but you'll understand my frustration, and it's very, very deep. But having worked on the health bill for the whole of a year, from January 2011 right through till the end of March 2012, the thing that most angered me was that there was never anybody in the press gallery, never anybody reports by the press, because it's the House of Lords and they never come to overlook and see what we're doing. No attempt to try to argue the case and show what we had actually done. And let me finally say, and ISIS is going to be landed with this, no alternative, I am going to give him a copy after this meeting of the one absolutely clear objective report, which is the report, oddly enough, of the House of Commons Library, no political party, not the Lib Dems, not the Tories, not Labour, but the House of Commons Library, on exactly what amendments were put forward, incidentally 1,300 of them, what amendments were passed, incidentally 435 of them, what those amendments said, and how far they changed the bill. And I'm going to send him a copy so that anybody in this room who questions what I've just said, or wants to know in greater detail what actually happened, can look in that undoubtedly objective document and find out what actually happened. Because I promise you on my own credibility, that the bill has now changed that act into something completely different than it started at the beginning, and one that I think will be able to address the very serious issues that confront our whole country in terms of health. Now, just one word about that, and now I go on to talk a little bit about what else we do in other areas. We know we have an aging population. We know that those of us who are in our 70s or 80s will probably live 10 more years than our parents and 20 more years than our grandparents. Many of you will remember that your grandparents started aging by the time they were 60, and now nobody ages until they're in their late 70s, and in the future they may not age at all, because this is a terrible thought that at least a third of us will live to be 100 if we're born today. Not one I find, I must say, particularly attractive, but it does look the way that the statistics are going. Now, in that situation, there's another huge block of people who are the result of the achievements of the NHS, the achievements. And those are people with chronic illnesses who will not have lived for more than a few years. Cystic fibrosis, epilepsy, strokes, health problems. Most of those people would not have lived for very many years after they find themselves against these incidents of illness and disease. Today, the great majority of people with chronic illnesses live for 15, 20 or even more years. Quite astonishing. People, for example, with a heart transplant now live for 15 to 20 years, and only 10 years ago that figure would have been between 5 and 7. People with strokes now return to normal life, who would not have survived those strokes only a few years ago. These are the triumphs of the NHS. But let us be absolutely honest. They are triumphs that leave an obligation, a responsibility, a commitment that is expensive, that has to be met, and that becomes a responsibility on the whole of society. So the pressures on the NHS grow all the time, not least because it has been so incredibly successful in so many ways. And that means we have to change our approach. The last thing I'm going to say. The NHS, when it was born, under my Bevan, in those great heroic days after the Second World War, above all thought in terms of curative medicine. You got ill, you were almost certainly quite quickly sent to hospital, you were cured and sent back again. Now we know that in order to make it possible for the NHS to survive and to meet the expectations placed upon it, that much more of the process of care and of rebuilding and of convalescence has to take part in the community. 2 examples, just very simple ones. There is no need for somebody who is dependent on something like warfarin to go to his or her GP every time something goes wrong with a drug regime. A qualified pharmacist can do that on the spot, immediately, without delay, and can have a named relationship to the patient. In other words, instead of going to GP's practice and waiting perhaps half an hour or three-quarters of an hour, or even worse, to A&E and waiting for an hour or two, every patient should be able to ring up just like that and get an answer to questions about a drug regime. A second example, and you know this as well as I do, that we have to persuade our population that looking after questions about alcoholism, the smoking of tobacco, and other things of that kind that lead, for example, diabetes, has got to increasingly be a responsibility of the whole of society, and not something that's cured when it's happened, because it never needed to happen in the first place. In other words, more of us must take more responsibility for our own health. But with those changes, we can make it work. Without them, almost certainly we'll fall into such difficult financial issues that we won't be able to solve them. Two more things before I sit down. What do we have to do now in other fields? What won't be easy as a result of the local elections, in part, will be the fact that we will get greater pressure now from right-wing conservatives to move away from the substantial concessions that they've been obliged to make to Liberal Democrats. They're already very restive. They're not pleased about the post office. They're not particularly pleased about what we've done with the NHS. They're not particularly pleased about what we've done with civil liberties. And so you're getting a more and more restive conservative element, the right-wing conservatives who are saying we've conceded too much to the Liberal Democrats. We'd rather do without them. It's sufficient to have a few of them around. We don't want many. On the other hand, because Labour has recovered to some extent, not least in the East Midlands, you're going to get more pressure from them as well. Ed Miliband's beginning to find a way to be the leader of the opposition. He hasn't found it easy, but I think he's beginning to slowly get there. In some ways, that's good for us, because it means that if there's a challenge from Labour, it'll be harder for right-wing conservatives to try to take the coalition over, because they will then just push people back into the Labour Party. But there are two things we can't avoid. The first of these I mentioned earlier, the scale of the bank crisis. The man who's also going to come to speak to you in the next few weeks, Vince Cable, has from the very beginning argued for a radical response to the problems of the bank. From the very beginning he said, this isn't just a few rich men who got it wrong. This is a deep systemic illness in the banking system. As a result of that, he was able to get the Vickers report accepted. You don't need to worry about all the details of the Vickers report, but let me sum it up very quickly. What it says is that you may not use the money that you and I save as ordinary citizens and plough it into casino banking, in other words, high-risk gamble banking, and then leave people with inability to pay their mortgages, to meet their basic needs, and all the rest of it. And that, of course, is what's happened. The banks, in many cases, played an extraordinary game with mortgages, offering people under Northern Rock and so on 135% mortgages. Most of us in this room, because many of you are people who've been around for a bit, will remember the days when bank managers said to you, are you sure you can afford? I'm afraid I can't consider more than a 75% mortgage, and if you look as if you're going to start a family, well, we'll have to rethink that too. Banking managers used to be a hard, strict, difficult bunch of people to persuade. And then suddenly they started throwing money at people who would never be able to pay it back, leaving young people in a desperate situation with mortgages that are so expensive they don't know where to start. We will see the Vickers report come through. We will see a division between casino banking and retail banking. We will see a public people's bank based on the post office counters system. And we will see, I believe, the coming of a green bank to help to finance new investment. But, and this is the last point of all, what we're still seeing today, even with the banks still making very substantial profits, we're shareholders at long last waking up and beginning to ask questions about whether Bob Down is really worth £16 million, or whether Royal Bank of Scotland is really worth the huge sums that they pay to their senior management. amazing story of paying the underperforming more and more highly. But the key question is this: how do we get the banks to lend money to the people we need to invest in order to provide the jobs that our young people need? I think we may have to get very tough indeed. I think we may even have to say, I'm sorry, there's no bailing out in future unless you start lending the money you've got stored up, and they have got huge sums stored up, to small businesses and to all the rest of it. We've got to take a very tough line. Vince will be anxious to take a tough line. Many of us will be anxious to take a tough line. But that is what Liberal Democrats need to do. They need to identify with people, as distinct from where originally Tony Blair came from, and then John Osborne came from, which was building cotton wool around the banks. We allowed our dependence on the banks as an economy to go far too far. We permitted the running down of manufacturing to go far too far. Last thought. If you look today at the countries among our region, Western Europe, who have suffered least from the banking crisis, who have been able to get through most easily, who have been able to keep their societies in a sound and reasonably contented form. They are Scandinavia, they are Germany, and they are the Netherlands. All those countries, and this is fundamental to me as a Liberal Democrat, I believe in it deeply, have balances between their rich and their poor, which are probably of the order of a ratio of 9 to 1. The people at the top get paid 9 times as much as the people at the bottom. The British figure is now well over 60 times those at the top compared to those at the bottom. In the end, you cannot hold a society together if you have inequalities as great as that. If you have a sense of injustice as great as that, sponsors and engenders. And that's why I think we as Liberal Democrats must start talking more and more loudly about the absolute unacceptability of societies that are that unequal, that unjust, that unfair. And I very much hope that Nick, Vince and the others will find their voices and start talking very loudly about the fact that the happiest societies in the world are those that have at least a balance of social justice within their societies. And that's something we have to recapture and discover and build upon. Thanks for listening.